Dr. Will Flanders for 5 minutes.
The mic on? Okay, there we go. All right, thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify here today. First, I think it's important to set the table about where the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty stands on election integrity issues more broadly. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, Will, and I'm not talking about myself in the third person here, we're talking about the organization Will henceforth, conducted an assessment of the election that was referred to by the Wall Street Journal as the best assessment of what happened. We found that while almost certainly the number of votes that did not comply with existing legal requirements exceeded Joe Biden's margin of victory in Wisconsin, there was no evidence that we uncovered of widespread voter fraud. Indeed, President Biden likely received more votes from eligible voters in Wisconsin than did President Trump. That said, there are credible reasons that the 2020 election shook the faith of many Americans in the electoral process. With the justification of the COVID-19 pandemic, many systems and rules were unilaterally abandoned without following proper legislative procedure, and new techniques were used to drive targeted voter turnout that existed in legal gray areas. This called into question the fundamental fairness of the election process. It is some of these issues that I'm here to discuss today. The prospect of private funding of elections ought to be of concern to voters across the political spectrum. Take any of the conservative boogeymen of the left, the Koch brothers, for example, and imagine they're sending money directly to election officials almost entirely in conservative-leaning areas of the nation. I feel confident in predicting that the same folks who are now complacent would be complaining loudly about the injustice of it. Yet that is what is happening with the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL funding. CTCL records for Wisconsin indicate that 216 communities across Wisconsin received a grant. Madison and Milwaukee, however, received a disproportionate share of the funding, about 45%, despite only representing about 14% of the state's population. In a statistical analysis, we compared the change in turnout between 2016 and 20 with whether or not a community received a CTCL grant. We found that communities that received a CTCL funding saw an increase in the number of votes for Democratic candidates in 2020 that was greater than in communities that did not receive the funding. On average, this works out to about 8,000 votes across the state of Wisconsin that can be correlated with CTCL funding. So while in our work we did dismiss what Representative Morelli called some conspiracy theories, like for example with the voting machines, this is a very real situation. This isn't some conspiracy theory. It's also important to note that CTCL grants were likely legal under Wisconsin law at the time they were made. As was mentioned, there have been efforts to, in subsequent years, to ban these grants that have not been signed into law by the governor. We currently have a constitutional amendment that will be going on to the ballot this fall to let the voters decide whether or not we want this funding to continue. This is important because even if we took CTCL at their word that this was a nonpartisan process, it doesn't mean that the next person engaged in similar tactics will even have the slightest lip service given to nonpartisanship. What we can say for certain is that CTCL did provide funding for a program that was ultimately judged to be illegal. As was mentioned by Chairman Stile, before the 2021 elections, the city of Racine introduced a mobile voting unit. This unit was purchased with CTCL funding in 2021, and the stated purpose of the van was to park in various areas around the city and allow people to fill out absentee ballots. Will has a legal arm, and our legal arm believed that the van was illegal under Wisconsin law for a number of different reasons. What we'll focus on today was a Wisconsin statute on absentee voting that states no site may be selected which provides an advantage to any political party. While other absentee ballot drop-off locations are in fixed buildings, Racine's mobile voting unit presented unique problems when it came to election fairness. Using data from the 2016, 18, and 20 general elections, we tried to determine the average partisan makeup of each ward in Racine. We found as the share of Democratic voters in a ward increased, so did the expected number of locations of the voting van in that ward. Across wards that were ultimately used in the 2022 primary, a hypothetical ward with 100% Democratic voters was expected to have 0.25 more voting locations than a ward with 0% Democratic voters. Looking at the list of all possible van locations, that number increased to 2.25. There are any number of reasons that the sites may have been selected. In the worst case scenario for election integrity, they may have been strategically chosen to benefit aligned politicians. In a more favorable light, they may have been chosen randomly to disperse throughout the city. Nevertheless, in the eyes of the law, the reasoning is irrelevant. If the locations chosen benefited one party over the other, and the van did, then the van was illegal. In the end, both of these issues come back to the concept of fairness and an equal application of the law to every American, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. I hope that we can all agree it is in America's interest that those on both sides of the aisle have their faith restored in our electoral process. Unfair election practices like those being discussed today only serve to undermine that faith and lend credibility to those who put forth less defensible claims of election fraud. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we'll welcome any questions later.